Hello, it's Amy. I'm here with chapter 6 of the Memoirs of the Princesse de Ligne. And I noticed in skimming through this chapter that we do have a heading titled The Library, which, as a library lover and a reader, I'm very interested to hear anything she has to say about the library at this convent. So here we go. About this time I was removed from the sacristy and put into the record office. I cried a great deal when I was sent there, for all the nuns were old grumblers, with the exception of Madame de la Conception, who was that of the Malboy family. She had a dignified manner, and it was easy to see she was a lady of high birth. She knew everything connected with the abbey, and it was a pleasure to listen to her anecdotes of former times at the monastery. Madame de la Conception had a mania for singing ballads. I never heard a more nasal voice. She sang every day to us the ballads of Judith, of Gabrielle de Vergy, and many others. Sometimes, to amuse us, she would show us some curious things, for they possessed among the records letters from Queen Blanche, from Anne of Brittany, and from several other queens of France addressed to the abbess of the convent. Letters from Guy de Laval to his aunt, the abbess of the Abbaye-aux-Bois, written when he was in the army during the disturbances of Charles VII's reign. La Hire and Dunois were mentioned in these letters, and several other interesting documents she showed us. The pupils at that time, on duty at the record office, were Mademoiselle du Camont, handsome, witty, but easily offended, aged 13. Mademoiselle d'Armel, 14, hideous, affected, but a good creature. Mademoiselle de Saint-Chamond, ugly, with very short legs, quite out of proportion to her body, 18 years old. Mademoiselle de Beaumont, ugly and lame, but a good soul. Mademoiselle de Servirac, 19 years of age, of noble appearance, but subject to spasms and rather crazy. Mademoiselle de Levis, kind, colorless, not clever, 14 years of age. Gracious. I get the sense that the Princesse de Ligne was perhaps not the kindest person to have in your acquaintance, and I do wonder, if she said these things to her friends, to people in gossip sessions, or if this was just something that she wrote in her memoirs and was not unkind to people in her everyday life, because it's quite savage to go about describing people as hideous and ugly with very short legs. But we do have a footnote here saying that the record office, the department consisted of a large hall entirely fitted up with drawers for the archives, a second hall containing the library of the repository, and a room for nuns in charge. There were 4 ladies, 2 secretaries, 6 pupils, and 2 lay sisters. And she wasn't quite finished listing all the people working in the record room. I have already mentioned Madame de Malboy and the other nuns at the record office. They were Madame de Saint-Romuald, an old grumpy, Madame de Saint-Germain, another old grumpy, Madame de Saint-Pabin, 48 years old, who never spoke and was very sly. We spent the whole day, Calmont and I, making fun of all these people. Madame de Saint-Romuald was 80 years old, and Madame de Saint-Germain 75. They spent the whole day quarreling, first about one thing and then another. It was really incredible. They were constantly making mistakes in their accounts and always put the fault on each other. It was comical to see them with their spectacles on, buried up to their noses in the large archive books. They spent their days reading either the old letters that the former abbesses of the Abbaye-aux-Bois had received, or else poring over the old lawsuits of those ladies. And if ever anyone wished to know anything concerning the abbey in former times, they never could tell a thing. On one occasion, Madame de Saint-Romuald had sent a sugar rasp to Madame de Saint-Germain, who either lost it or forgot she had it. One Sunday, during High Mass, Madame de Saint-Romuald remembers her rasp, and as these 2 centuries were seated side by side, Madame de Saint-Romuald leans over to Madame de Saint-Germain and says in a low tone, "By the by, you have not returned me my rasp." "What do you mean by your rasp?" "What? I did not lend you my rasp?" Madame de Saint-Germain, annoyed at such a request in church. "I have not got your rasp." The other, getting angry and raising her voice, "Give me back my rasp." They continued so long and so loud that the pupils burst out laughing. Astonished at this, the lady abbess asked what had taken place. She was told. She sent word to the 2 ladies to be quiet, and she would send them each a rasp. When they returned to the office, they sulked at each other for a whole week, and whenever sugar or things lent were mentioned, Madame de Saint-Romuald would at once relate the story of her rasp. How she had once had one, that she had lent it, and that it had been lost. Then Madame de Saint-Germain would say that it was not true, and we often amused ourselves with putting the conversation on the subject so as to see them quarrel. On leaving the record office, Helene went to the refectory department, where she spent 2 months. Her duties consisted in waiting on the pupils at table, helping to lay the cloth to keep the refectory in order, and put away the glass and china, etc., all useful acquirements for a future mistress of a household. However, although so busy in the refectory, Helene did not neglect her accomplishments. At that time I danced in the ballets of Orpheus and Eurydice. We danced them in our theatre, which was a very fine one and handsomely decorated. It was at the house of the garden, at the end of the garden, near the old plague house. We were in all 55 dancers. Mademoiselle de Choiseul danced as Orpheus, Mademoiselle de Damas as Eurydice, I as Cupid, Mesdemoiselles de Chavigny and Monsège were 2 attendants. There were 10 dancers of the funeral entry, 10 of the Furies, 10 as Orpheus's followers, 10 as Eurydice's, and 10 for the court of love. That winter we also played Polyeucte in the convent theatre. I took the part of Pauline. Mademoiselle de Chatillon was Polyeucte, and Mademoiselle de Choiseul Sévère. It was a great success. Shortly after, they made us study the Cid, and I played Rodriguez and also Cornelia in the Death of Pompey. These performances were so full of interest for the little actresses that they frequently devoted their recreation hours to the study of their parts. The audience was composed of the mothers and relations of the pupils and their friends, and these plays were the talk of all Paris. However, these worldly amusements did not interfere with the regular course of their duties. After the refectory, Helene tells us, I was a fortnight on service at the gate. There were 5 of us, Mademoiselle de Morard, 14 years old, rather pretty but stupid and insipid, Mademoiselle de Nagu, aged 17, pretty and amiable, Mademoiselle de Chebrillon, ugly but clever, 14 years of age, Mademoiselle de Barbatin, 15 years old, looking like a boy, a romp, pretty, and a very good dancer. Our duty was to accompany the portress whenever she went to open the outer gate. The movement was perpetual. At one moment the masters, then the doctors, or else the directors. In fact, Mesdames de Fumel and de Pradines, the 2 portresses, were completely tired out by the evening. We did not like the former. She was sour, dry, and ill-natured. The turning box, where I was sent next, suited me better. We saw a number of people all day long. I was there with Amante, Cossé, and Calasis, all very amiable young ladies. The 2 nuns in charge, Mesdames de Kelvison and de Nourgeret, were sisters. The latter was fond of reading and very learned. We had to ring for everyone who was wanted, and there was a different bell for each person. It was rather difficult not to make a mistake. For one, there would be 3, 8, and a peal. For another, V, 8, and a peal. It was endless. Amante was 18 years old, and was witty and talented. She was rather pretty and had been married some time. Cossé was only 12. She was plain, but full of charm and very delicate. She married later the Duc de Mormont. Madame de Vaux, of whom I have already spoken, was good-natured and pretty, but silly. Lastly, Mademoiselle de Calasis, very pretty, 15 years old, rather an invalid. This department amused us, but as the work was very fatiguing, no one ever remained there long. From the duties of the tower, I passed on to those of the community. I could have spent a long time in this department without feeling dull, if only I had been left there. I was with Mademoiselle de Talleyrand, who was pretty, amiable, and very popular, and Mademoiselle de Perigord, her sister, also pretty, Mademoiselle de Duras, pretty and rather amiable, and finally Mademoiselle de Spinola, who was awkward, ill-natured, but very handsome. Among the ladies who attended to these duties was an old nun named Madame de St. Charles. Although 75 years old, she was lively and nothing disturbed her. We might make any noise around her. She did not mind it. There were always about 50 people in the community room, busy at all kinds of needlework. Talleyrand played the harpsichord and I the harp, and we sang. These concerts greatly amused the nuns. This room was hung all round with full-length portraits of the abbesses of the Abbaye-aux-Bois. Nearly all of them had their coats of arms painted on an execution at their feet. In this way, one could tell who they were. Mother St. Charles told us of an adventure that occurred during her novitate, which I will relate here. On one occasion, a certain Madame de St. Onge came to propose her daughter as novice to Madame de la Trémoulier, at that time abbess of the Abbaye-aux-Bois. The young lady seemed of a gentle disposition, and moreover, the mother offered a pension and dowry suitable for a girl of good family. She was therefore accepted and entered the convent the next day, and soon every one in the convent was enchanted with her wit, and her gentleness. She was novice together with several others, including Madame de St. Charles, who sometimes said to her, "Mademoiselle de St. Onge, it is incredible that a young lady so modest and well-bred as you should have the gestures and manners that you sometimes have, for when you standing before the fireplace, you spread your feet in an odd manner. And when you move up your chair, you often seem about to take hold of it between your knees. In fact, it is extraordinary to see in the same person an air of modesty verging on constraint, occasionally combined with the gestures of a musketeer." Mademoiselle de St. Onge blushingly replied that she had been brought up with a brother whose manners she used to copy as a child, and that she had never quite got rid of them. One night, during a terrible thunderstorm, Madame de St. Charles, who at that time was Mademoiselle de Ranchy, came and knocked at the cell of Mademoiselle de St. Onge and begged her to open the door. Mademoiselle de St. Onge kept her waiting a few moments, and then opened. "Ah," said Mademoiselle de Ranchy, "I am horribly frightened in my cell. You must let me sleep in yours till the storm is gone." But Mademoiselle de St. Onge would not hear of it, telling her the holy rules forbade it, and begged her to go away. At last, Mademoiselle de Ranchy, seeing she was determined not to let her remain in her cell, went away highly displeased at this want of good nature. When Mademoiselle de St. Onge had been doing her novitate for 3 months, her mother came one day to the lady abbess to say that her daughter felt no longer any vocation for a religious life, and to beg that she might be restored to her. Mademoiselle de St. Onge departed, to the grief of the whole convent, who regretted her very much. Some days later, Madame de St. Onge wrote to the lady abbess, asking to beg her pardon for the deception she had practiced on her. She informed her that she had had in her establishment her son instead of her daughter, the young man having had the misfortune to kill his adversary in a duel. She had made him wear his sister's clothes, and had put him in the Abbaye-aux-Bois, that being the only plan she could devise for sheltering him from the severity of the law. The lady abbess replied that since the thing was done, she congratulated herself that by this means the life had been saved of one who, during his stay in her house, had given her such a good impression of his character. Madame de St. Charles told us that Mademoiselle de St. Onge would often inadvertently speak of herself in the masculine gender. The library. At length I was sent to the library, to the great satisfaction of Madame de Mortemart. I was seated quietly, reading in the kitchen, when they came to tell me that I was appointed to the library. I quickly ran to find Madame de St. Delphine. As soon as she saw me, she said, "At last you have come to me. I hope we shall spend our lives together." Indeed, I hardly left her. She was nearly always at her sister's, and I with her. She took no more notice of what happened to the books than if they had not existed, and yet she was fond of reading. When she wanted a book, she would ask Madame de Saint Joachim for it. Sometimes, when she was in the library and saw that when books were fetched or returned, Madame de Saint Joachim noted them down, she would express her astonishment at so much trouble being taken. I spent the morning doing commissions for her, and generally went to her immediately after appearing before Madame de Rouchart in the morning class. After going to prime, a term of the Roman Catholic liturgy, the first canonical hour succeeding lauds, beginning at 6 in the morning. After going to prime, she had gravely returned to bed and thought no more of getting up. When I went in, I used to say, "Madame, it is 8:30 o'clock." Ah, good heavens, is it possible? I cannot believe it. Sometimes Madame de Rouchart, on returning from the schoolroom, would come into her cell and say, "My sister, it is shameful for a nun to still be in bed." Thereupon Madame de Saint Delphine would reply, "I have taken no vow not to sleep to my heart's content." Madame de Rouchart would then say, "Well, Helene, you must make my sister get up." I would call Sister Léonard, then she would close her curtains, put on her chemise, and dress herself without doing her hair. She looked charming thus, when dressed with her head still bare. She kept her hair rather long, for fear of catching cold. It was of the most beautiful colour. She next washed her head in tepid water, and put on her guêpe and veil. "Madame," I would say, "is there nothing you have forgotten?" "No, nothing today." But scarcely had she entered the library. And here we go, here's a footnote. The library at the Abbaye-aux-Bois occupied 3 large halls, contained 16,000 volumes, and possessed a very complete collection of theological works. But scarcely had she entered the library when she exclaimed, "Helene, I have forgotten my handkerchief." I would run to fetch it. Sometimes it was one thing, sometimes another. She would keep me thus running about all the morning, but I was so fond of her that I did not mind. And that is the end of chapter 6. I do regret that we don't get a more fulsome description of the library, but I guess not all memoirists are that interested, or have been as that interested in libraries and books as some of their readers are. So we'll leave it at that for today, and I'll be back in a couple of days with chapter 7.